Welcome back, everyone. In this set of videos, we'll be talking about the nasal cavity, the sinuses, and the ear. We'll start it off with the divisions of the ear. In this video, we're going to talk about a lot. We're really going to lay the groundwork for the ear. So this is going to feel like a lot. As we move on to the next videos, we're going to kind of build in a lot of those same structures and talk about them in more detail. So hopefully by the end of these sets, you will feel a lot better about what you hear in this very first video. So the learning objectives here are: what are those three divisions of the ear, and what are their boundaries, contents, and functions? We'll start here with the external ear. The external ear will gather sound. It'll change that sound and move it on to the tympanic membrane. So the external ear begins with what is called the auricle and then ends by the tympanic membrane or the eardrum. So the auricle, or the pinna is another word used to describe it, is cartilaginous, has elastic cartilage, and it actually can change shape. And this you can think of more so as an ear horn, or like a, hey, what are you saying? Say that again. And the number of convolutions and the way that the pinna looks or the auricle looks in different species changes significantly. So humans have less of an exaggerated kind of convolutions compared to a critter like a bat. So from the auricle, sound will move into the external acoustic meatus. Now the external acoustic meatus proximally is cartilage and then becomes an osseous or a bony portion. So when we were looking at a skull previously, we saw that external acoustic meatus. You can imagine it extends a little further through cartilage toward this pinna or auricle. At the end of the external acoustic meatus is where we find the tympanic membrane. So externally, this is covered in skin, whereas internally it's covered in mucosa to match the compartment that it's within. One way to visualize the tympanic membrane is through an otoscope. And I'll note as well that external acoustic meatus is not necessarily a straight tube. It's more so an S shape. So if you've ever tried to look at yours or someone else's tympanic membrane, you kind of have to pull the ear back a little bit to straighten that tube out to see in to find the tympanic membrane. Now, when you see the tympanic membrane, there are a couple of features right away. So first off, this outer portion right here is the external acoustic meatus. Here we see the tympanic membrane. Right in the middle, kind of this lighter in color portion is where the malleus, or the first ossicle, articulates with the tympanic membrane. So this portion is called the umbo. Just above, superior and anterior to the umbo, you find a small area called the flaccid part. Now, most of the tympanic membrane is made up of the tense part. And you can see that there are these folds that attach both posteriorly and anteriorly from that malleus toward those areas. Now let's move into the middle ear. Here we're conducting that sound energy that came through vibrations in the air through that tympanic membrane into the ossicles. So now the ossicles are going to carry these vibrations from the tympanic membrane toward the internal ear, toward the cochlea. Within the middle ear, starting at the tympanic membrane, we see the malleus. Now the malleus is named that it is looking like a hammer, and its handle sits upon the tympanic membrane and within it. From there, we move on to the incus, found most intermediate incus. Then most internally, we find the stapes. And the stapes is the smallest bone in your entire body. We have one on either side. Same with the other ossicles. All right, so we're going to take it wall by wall now. If you think of the middle ear, it's sort of a square-ish. The walls are a little bit more concave than a typical cube, but we're going to just turn and look at each wall. So imagine you're standing inside of the middle ear, and now you turn back to see where you came from. So you've walked in through this area, which is the lateral wall. Now, the lateral wall is made up of that tympanic membrane as well as the malleus. So the malleus sitting within the tympanic membrane. Also on this lateral wall, we'll find the chordotympany nerve, which runs along both the tympanic membrane and the malleus. And we'll also see this tensor tympani muscle, which is attached to a portion, the handle or the manubrium of the malleus, and will control the actions or control the movements of the malleus. Now, if we look at this on a donor, we can see it's a little bit less straightforward when things aren't all bright colors, right? But let's first find this tympanic membrane. And again, we're looking at this from the middle ear toward the lateral wall. And so what you can see is the portion of malleus here that's connected to the tympanic membrane. And then the next of the ossicles, the incus, which articulates with the malleus. We also see this chordotympany nerve running along through, and a very slight kind of view of the tendon of the tensor tympani muscle that attaches down to that malleus bone. All right, so turn yourself around 180 degrees. We're now seeing the last part of the ossicles, the stapes, right here. And the stapes communicates with the vestibule, which then communicates with the cochlea back here through what is called the oval window. So we can't necessarily see the shape of it here because it is filled with the foot plate or the base of the stapes bone. Just inferior to that, we find the round window. We'll talk about both of these windows in a future video and sort of what their functions are. But for now, we see them on the medial wall. Also on the medial wall, we find what is called the promontory. So this is the initial portion of the cochlea, as you can see, leading from what is the vestibule here, over here toward the cochlea, which will then curl up on itself like a little shell. So this initial portion kind of bends toward the medial wall and protrudes into it. So that promontory kind of sticks into the middle ear, and that is right where we find the tympanic plexus forming. You'll remember the tympanic plexus and the tympanic nerve when we were talking about the parotid gland innervation. So more on this in a later video as well, but we can see here where the tympanic nerve, a branch of glossopharyngeal, enters into the middle ear, forms this tympanic plexus, and will exit the middle ear as the lesser petrosal nerve. Now, in this image, I've also kind of shown you this posterior wall. So there are three major kind of protrusions, similar to what we saw with this promontory, that come out from the posterior wall toward the middle ear cavity. So the first that we see most kind of superiorly and posteriorly here is a prominence of the lateral semicircular canal. So here is one of the semicircular canals, here is another, and here is another. All of these are oriented in XYZ planes to detect different types of movements. Now, just anterior to the prominence for the lateral semicircular canal, we find the facial nerve shown here within the bony facial canal. So we'll see kind of a bump of bone that will stick into the middle ear. Now the last portion here is called the pyramidal eminence. The pyramidal eminence, also a bony eminence coming from the posterior wall, and this is containing a muscle that attaches to stapes. So this muscle is called the stapedius muscle and will extend from the pyramidal eminence toward the stapes as we see here. Again, as a pause, these things will come back, I absolutely promise you, but take in all of the landscape first and we'll dial in on details as we go on to new videos. Now, in a donor, what we can see here first is that tiny little stapes bone right there. So you can kind of See, it looks a bit like a stirrup shape. So where the foot plate meets the vestibule is the oval window. Now, inferior to that, also kind of on this medial wall, we find the round window. Just anterior to these now, we can see the nerve that's passing up here is the tympanic nerve from glossopharyngeal, and a bit of the plexus on top of the promontory as it then heads up. So we see the tympanic plexus on the promontory and the tympanic nerve here. The last thing that we can see here is a bit of the facial nerve. So we're not quite getting the full impact of the facial canal protruding into the space, but you get the idea of how it would then course down into this region. All right, so now we've looked at the lateral wall, our entrance. We've looked at the medial wall, our exit. Now let's look at all of it from the anterior surface and take a look at both the anterior and the posterior walls. So before we move on to anything, let's orient ourselves. Here is the tympanic membrane, a good starting point when you're looking at any of these. This nerve running along it, that was the chorda tympani nerve. So this is our lateral wall. Our medial wall is sitting here, kind of further away from us. We're a little bit turned, so that medial wall is here. Anterior is kind of in this general direction, leading then to our perspective being mostly posterior. So let's start with the anterior structures. One of them we've talked about already, and that's the tensor tympani muscle. Well, remember that that attaches to the malleus here, and it actually projects from the anterior wall into the middle ear where it then attaches. And one of its attachment points anteriorly is the pharyngotympanic tube. So right here in this gray-blue is the cartilage of the pharyngotympanic tube. And we'll find the opening closer to the ear there. But these two are attached to one another and both are on that anterior wall. The other structure we find on the anterior wall is the carotid canal. So again, we're seeing the internal carotid artery here, not necessarily the bony carotid canal, but you get the idea of how this would then sit anterior to the middle ear structures here. Now, in terms of our posterior wall structures, we can find something right away back here. This is an air-filled space here called the mastoid antrum, and it'll communicate between the middle ear, which is also air-filled, and these air-filled mastoid air cells. These are found within the mastoid process. So it's very similar in concept to the paranasal sinuses, which we'll learn about coming up. But rather than communicating with the nasal cavity, we see they communicate with the middle ear. Now, the entrance to this mastoid antrum is called the adductus. So basically just that opening leading to that space and beyond. Now, just superior to the mastoid antrum, we find this little disc of bone. And you can actually imagine it kind of extending more anteriorly here. And this disc or small layer of bone is called the tegmen tympani. And the tegmen tympani is essentially the roof of the middle ear. And it is what forms the boundary between the middle ear space and the middle cranial fossa that would be found just superior. Now, just inferior to this tegmen tympani, we find a space called the atticus. And the atticus, also known as the attic, can help us remember basically where this space is. So if we kind of draw a little bit in here, imagine it extends kind of in this general space, and it is above the tympanic membrane at this level and below the tegmen tympani here. So you can imagine it like an attic above a living space. We saw most of our middle ear structures more inferiorly here, and then just above it, we see the malleus and the incus, portions of them, extend into this space, And the space is also continuous with the mastoid antrum. Now, when you're thinking about the atticus and the mastoid antrum, you can be thinking more so superior and posterior back here. In terms of inferior and posterior, that's where we find the opening for the chorda tympani nerve. So this is the opening within the facial canal where chorda tympani will exit and enter the middle ear space. Then we see it courses anteriorly here, over the malleus, over the tympanic membrane, and then heads toward the petrotympanic fissure where it will exit the middle ear. All right, so we have kind of, based on those images, we have a bit of a video orienting us to all these different views. So this right away is that cartilage of the pharyngotympanic tube. We can see semicircular canals in the cochlea there, and those are fully embedded in the temporal bone within that petrous part. From the anterior wall, we can see both that cartilage of the pharyngotympanic tube as well as the tensor tympani muscle. When we hide those things, we can see a little bit better. Here is the tympanic membrane. This nerve back there can follow right up and around here. It's actually going to come in this way and then course downward here. And when it comes around, it gives off this branch, the chorda tympani. So this is the facial nerve, and this, one of its branches, is the chorda tympani. There we see the malleus, and that's the mastoid antrum there. And this whole area represented back there are the mastoid air cells within the mastoid process. All right, so hopefully that kind of makes some sense. Again, if it doesn't stick the very first time through, that's okay. This is an extremely difficult area to visualize. And as I said, we'll kind of keep coming back to these different walls as we talk about these structures in detail. So let's move on to the internal ear. The internal ear contains these apparatuses, which are membrane-lined bony passages, and they facilitate hearing and balance. So hearing is facilitated through the cochlea. You can think of a conch shell or a snail shell. That's sort of what this looks like. Then the semicircular canals are more so related to balance and specifically angular acceleration. So think of your head being in different positions rather than straight up and down. So the vestibule is this opening, this kind of entrance into both the semicircular canals and the cochlea. And it contains vestibular sacs that detect linear acceleration. So here you can think about the feeling of going forward in a car or going up and down in an elevator. In terms of the internal ear, what we're able to see in this donor is nicely this cochlea. It looks, like I said, kind of like a snail shell. And then we also see these semicircular canals. So they're all oriented in kind of a different axis. There's the third one there. And here is the nerve that innervates both. So think about what innervates the vestibular and the cochlear systems. If you said the vestibulocochlear nerve or cranial nerve 8, you are correct. So more on that in a little bit, but you can kind of see that nerve sitting right there. Before we move on, take a deep breath. It's okay if you didn't get it all first time through. Let's talk through this question. Which ossicle forms the umbo at its articulation with the tympanic membrane? Is it the incus, the malleus, or the stapes? So take a moment to write down the answer you think it is. And when you're ready, what did you say? So the tympanic membrane, we'll remember this structure right here, somewhat, not a great circle there. That is the boundary between the external ear here, and then on the other side of this membrane we'd find the middle ear. So which ossicle will take those vibrations from the tympanic membrane onward? So the ossicle we see right here, that's its handle or its manubrium, again, more on that. And this is the malleus. So the ordering of these ossicles will go M, malleus, I, incus, S, stapes. If that helps. If not, think malleus and tympanic membrane, stapes and oval window, incus is intermediate. That's everything for this video. Thank you so much for your attention. Please feel free to reach out with questions, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.